Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. We're diving into a topic today that I think a lot of you are going to find really interesting and maybe even a little bit eye-opening.
Definitely eye-opening and maybe a little bit uncomfortable too, because we're going to be talking about family dynamics. And sometimes those conversations can get, well,
Yeah, a little close to home, right?
exactly.
So you, our awesome listeners, sent in a ton of requests to cover a piece by Dr. Saul McLeod about enmeshed parenting. Clearly, this is something that resonates with a lot of you.
Yeah, and it's not surprising. It's something that's really common, but often flies under the radar. People might not even realize that the dynamic they have with their family isn't uh totally healthy, you know?
Right, it can feel like, oh, this is just how my family is, we're super close, but enmeshment goes beyond just being close.
It sure does. And that's what we're going to unpack today in this deep dive. We're going to look at what enmeshed parenting is, how it shows up in everyday life, and also what some of the long-term effects can be.
And most importantly, for those of you who are recognizing this pattern, maybe in your own families, we're going to talk about some ways to, maybe start shifting those dynamics in a healthier direction.
Exactly.
So to kind of set the stage here, I think it's helpful to go back to the work of Salvador Minuchin. He's kind of a big deal in family systems theory.
Oh, yeah, Minuchin. He coined the term enmeshment to describe these families where the boundaries between individuals are, they're kind of blurry.
Blurry, yeah. So instead of each person having a clear sense of themselves and where they end and the other person begins, everyone's kind of tangled up emotionally, psychologically.
It's like you're trying to separate two colors of paint that have been mixed together a little too well. It's hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. And in a family system, that can create some real challenges.
Yeah, and Minuchin's work in family systems theory really highlights how everything in a family is interconnected. You know,
Hmm.
one person's behavior affects everyone else. And enmeshment, that's like a particular pattern within that system.
And what's so tricky is that from the inside, it can feel like this really intense love and closeness, right? Like you're this super tight-knit unit.
It can almost feel like a badge of honor. We're closer than any other family.
Right, exactly. But the thing is, this blurring of boundaries, where everyone's so deeply involved in each other's lives, it can actually hinder a child's ability to develop a strong sense of self, to become their own person.
And to be able to function independently as an adult.
Exactly. Because you never really had the chance to figure out who you are separate from the family unit.
And in some cases, the article actually uses terms like emotional incest or covert incest.
Wow. Yeah. Strong language, huh?
Yeah, pretty intense.
Hmm.
And it's used to describe those more extreme situations where, the child is almost treated like a partner to the parent rather than a child. Like they're expected to fulfill the parent's emotional needs.
That's definitely crossing a line. It really puts a burden on the child that they're not equipped to handle.
Right. And could have some serious long-term consequences that we'll get into a bit later. But first, I think it would be helpful to get a better understanding of how this enmeshment actually plays out in everyday family life. You know, what are some of the concrete ways that it shows up?
Okay, so let's start with something that, might be a little easier to grasp. Privacy and personal boundaries.
Yeah, I think everyone can relate to that on some level. We all need our space, right?
Absolutely. But in enmeshed families, children often don't get that. There's not a lot of respect for personal space, both physically and emotionally. Parents, they kind of insist on knowing every single detail of their kid's life.
So it's not just, hey, how was your day at school? It's like they need to know what every single conversation was about, who you sat with at lunch.
Yeah, everything. Like they might read their diaries, listen in on phone calls, barge into their room without knocking, anything to kind of stay in the loop,
Yeah, it's like
Yeah.
the child doesn't have any sense of ownership over their own thoughts and feelings.
And the thing is, if a child tries to push back, to create some boundaries, the parent often reacts with hurt or anger. How dare you keep secrets from me? Don't you trust me? That kind of thing.
Guilt trip city.
Big time. And it sends this message to the child that they're not allowed to have anything that's truly their own.
And often hand in hand with this lack of privacy comes a pretty strong desire from the parent to control the child's actions and choices.
Right. And not just like, the little things, like what they wear. We're talking about major life decisions, like what college they go to, what career path they choose.
Yeah, the article gives this really sad example of a teenager who felt immense pressure to go to the college their parent had picked out.
And the kid might even be really talented in something else, like, art or music, but they're discouraged from pursuing it
Yeah.
because it's not what the parent wants.
It's like the child's life is seen as an extension of the parent's own dreams and ambitions.
And it can be really hard to break free from that.
And then there's this other aspect of enmeshed parenting that Dr. McLeod talks about. And I think this one is, um, it's kind of subtle, but it's really powerful. It's the use of guilt and emotional coercion.
Oh, yeah, this is a big one. This is where the parent essentially communicates that the child is responsible for the parent's emotional well-being.
So it's not just, I want you to be happy. It's more like, I need you to be happy so that I can be happy.
Exactly. And the child ends up feeling this huge burden, this responsibility to, to keep the parent from feeling sad or anxious or lonely.
And so if the child tries to do something for themselves, like, maybe they want to spend more time with their friends or join a club or whatever, the parent will often react with guilt trips.
Ah, so you're just gonna abandon me?
You don't care about how I feel?
And it's so manipulative because the child ends up feeling like they're being selfish for wanting things that are, perfectly normal for a kid their age to want.
And it can make it really hard for them to develop a healthy sense of independence.
So basically, the child learns to constantly prioritize the parent's needs and emotions above their own. And that can set the stage for some real problems later on.
Yeah, like this constant emotional pressure. It can lead to what the article calls emotional fusion.
Right. This is where the boundaries between the child's emotions and the parent's emotions become, like, totally blurred.
So instead of having their own separate emotional experiences, they're kind of just like mirroring each other's feelings.
Yeah, it's almost like they become emotionally enmeshed, right? So if the parent is anxious, the child feels anxious. If the parent is sad, the child feels sad.
And the article highlights how this can lead to children becoming what they call hypervigilant. Like they're constantly on high alert, trying to anticipate the parent's mood and adjust their own behavior accordingly.
They become these little emotional barometers, constantly trying to gauge how the parent is feeling and trying to, to fix it if they sense any negativity.
And it's exhausting.
Oh, totally. It's like they're carrying this invisible emotional weight all the time.
And it makes it really difficult for them to develop a sense of their own separate, independent identity.
Because they're so focused on the parent's emotional state, they never really get the chance to, you know, to explore their own inner world.
Yeah, and the article makes this point about how in enmeshed families, any attempt by the child to individuate, to become their own person, is often seen as a threat.
Yeah, it's like the parent takes it personally, like it's a rejection of them.
And they might respond by doing things for the child that the child is perfectly capable of doing themselves.
Mm.
Like they might continue to, pick out their clothes or do their laundry, even when the child is a teenager.
Or they might refuse to acknowledge the child's growing maturity, like, oh, you're not ready for that yet. You're still my baby.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to keep the child dependent on them.
And if the child keeps pushing for independence, the parent might ramp up the guilt and the emotional pressure.
If you really loved me, you wouldn't do this.
You're breaking my heart.
It's a lot for a young person to deal with.
And it can really stunt their emotional growth.
Another important aspect that the article talks about is this no outsiders mentality that can develop in enmeshed families.
Yeah, it's like this unspoken rule that family comes first, always. And I mean, to a certain extent, that's a good thing, right?
Sure, family's important.
But in enmeshed families, it becomes this really unhealthy dynamic. Like any relationship outside the family is seen as a potential threat.
So if the child has friends, the parent might be jealous. Or if they start dating, the parent might try to sabotage the relationship.
They might constantly criticize the friend or the boyfriend or girlfriend, or they might make it really difficult for the child to spend time with them.
And they might even badmouth them behind their back.
Yeah.
Trying to turn the child against them.
It's all about maintaining control and keeping the family unit closed off from the outside world.
And then there's this dynamic of role reversal that often happens in enmeshed families, what therapists call parentification.
This is where the child ends up taking on the role of the parent, essentially. They become the parent's confidant, their emotional caregiver.
So instead of the parent providing support and guidance to the child is the one who's expected to be the emotional rock.
And they might be exposed to things that are really inappropriate for their age, like details about the parent's marriage problems or financial struggles or, other adult issues.
And they're expected to, offer advice and comfort, which is a huge burden for a child to carry.
It's like the roles are completely reversed.
And it can really mess with their sense of, of what a healthy parent-child relationship is supposed to look like.
The article gives this really clear example. It talks about a 14-year-old girl named Sarah, and she's got this really enmeshed relationship with her mom. Can we maybe walk through that scenario a little bit, just to kind of illustrate how these different aspects of enmeshment can play out in real life?
Yeah, let's do that. So Sarah's mom, she's super involved in Sarah's schoolwork, right? Like she's basically doing her homework for her.
Yeah, and picking out her project topics and, editing her essays. And if Sarah tries to do anything on her own, her mom acts all hurt, like, don't you trust my judgment?
Guilt trip, guilt trip.
Total guilt trip. And when Sarah wants to hang out with her friends, her mom will often say things like, well, I guess I'll just be here by myself. It's fine.
Classic manipulation.
Right. And so Sarah ends up staying home because she feels this intense pressure to keep her mom company.
And Sarah also gets dragged into all of her mom's adult problems. Like she knows all about her parents' arguments and their financial worries.
Which is way too much for a 14-year-old to be dealing with, right?
Absolutely. And if Sarah ever tries to set any boundaries, to ask for a little bit of space, her mom gets really upset. Like she starts questioning their relationship, don't you love me anymore?
And Sarah, being a teenager and wanting her mom's approval, she just gives in.
And so, she ends up sacrificing her own needs and her own desires to keep her mom happy.
It's a really sad example of how enmeshment can, it can really rob a child of their individuality.
Yeah, it's like their life is not really their own. And what's so insidious about all of this is that, for the child growing up in this kind of family system, it just feels normal.
Right. It's all they've ever known.
It's not until they get older, maybe they go to therapy or they start having problems in their own relationships, that they start to realize, wait a minute, something's not quite right here.
And what's important to remember is that in most cases, the parents aren't intentionally trying to harm their children.
They probably think they're doing what's best.
Exactly. They might genuinely believe that they're being loving and protective. But the thing is, their own emotional needs are kind of getting in the way.
Yeah, and they might be repeating patterns that they learned in their own families, It's like this cycle that gets passed down through generations.
Which is why it's so important to become aware of these dynamics and to start breaking those unhealthy cycles.
Right. So for those of you listening who are, maybe starting to recognize some of these patterns in your own families, what are some signs that you might be dealing with the aftermath of growing up in an enmeshed family system?
Okay, so one of the biggest ones is this feeling of being responsible for other people's emotions.
Especially your parents' emotions.
Yeah, like you're constantly monitoring how they're feeling, and you feel this overwhelming need to fix it if they're upset.
So, for example, you might find yourself constantly checking in on them, calling them every day, making sure they're okay.
And you might feel really guilty if you're doing something enjoyable while you know that they're going through something difficult.
Yeah, it's like your own happiness is contingent on their happiness.
And this can be a really tough pattern to break because it's so ingrained, It's been there since childhood.
Another big sign is difficulty regulating your own emotions.
So people who grew up in enmeshed families, they often struggle with, with identifying and managing their own feelings.
Some people might be really emotionally reactive, you
Yeah.
know? Like they have these really intense emotional outbursts.
And that's because they're used to being in this kind of emotionally charged environment, where everyone's feelings are all over the place.
But then other people might be like the opposite. They might be really emotionally numb.
Yeah, they've learned to shut down their feelings because it was just too overwhelming to deal with them as a child.
And they might have a really low tolerance for any kind of stress or conflict.
Because they never really learned how to cope with those things on their own.
And underneath all of that, the article says there's often a lot of repressed anger and resentment.
Yeah, it makes sense, right? Because the child was essentially robbed of their childhood, their individuality.
And they weren't allowed to express their anger directly.
Right. So it gets bottled up inside, and then later on, it can manifest in all sorts of ways, like unexplained irritability or depression or even physical health problems.
And sometimes it comes out as anger towards the parents, you know? Like, why did you do this to me?
But sometimes it's directed inward, like, why am I so messed up?
And that can be really damaging.
Yeah, it's important to acknowledge that anger and to find healthy ways to process it.
Another sign that the article talks about is difficulty knowing or expressing your own needs and opinions.
Like you're always deferring to other people. What do you want to do? I don't care. You pick.
Because you're so used to putting everyone else's needs first, right?
Exactly. And you might be really afraid of, of expressing an opinion that's different from your parents' opinion or your partner's opinion or whoever.
Because you're so worried about displeasing them,
And that goes back to that fear of rejection that we were talking about earlier.
right? And then there's this tendency to, to seek approval from your parents, even as an adult.
Like you need their permission to make major life decisions.
The article gives this example of a 42-year-old who felt like they needed their parents' approval to buy a car.
Which is kind of crazy, right? I mean, you're a grown adult.
But it shows how deeply ingrained these patterns can be.
And it can really hold you back from living your own life.
And then, of course, there's the whole issue of boundaries.
Or the lack thereof, right?
People who grew up in enmeshed families, they often have a really hard time setting boundaries with their family members.
Saying no can feel almost impossible.
And if they do try to set a boundary, they often get hit with a ton of guilt and manipulation.
How could you do this to me after all I've done for you?
And so they end up giving in, just to avoid the conflicts.
Which perpetuates the enmeshed dynamic, right?
And it prevents them from creating a healthy separation from their family.
And then there's this feeling of still being merged with a parent,
Even though you're an adult and you have your own life.
It's like you can't quite separate yourself emotionally.
So you might find yourself constantly thinking about them, worrying about them.
And their moods can really affect you. Like if they're having a bad day, you're having a bad day.
It's like you're still emotionally entangled.
And it can be really hard to create a sense of your own separate identity.
And all of this, as the article explains, can have a huge impact on your adult relationships.
Yeah, because if you haven't fully separated from your family of origin, it can be really hard to form healthy, independent relationships with other people.
So, for example, you might find yourself constantly talking about your parents with your partner. Or you might involve them in every decision you make.
Or you might feel like you have to choose between your partner and your family.
And that can create a lot of tension and conflict.
Yeah, because your partner might start to feel like they're always competing with your family for your attention.
And they might feel like they can never really get close to you because there's always this third person in the relationship.
It's a parent.
Right. And then any attempt to create some distance from your family, to become more independent, can trigger all sorts of intense emotional reactions.
Both within yourself and from your family.
So you might feel this huge surge of anxiety, this fear of abandoning them.
And they might react really negatively, they might get angry or guilt trip you or even try and make you feel sorry for them.
Like, you're breaking my heart, you're all I have.
Yeah, it can be really dramatic.
And it can make it really hard to break free.
And even if you do manage to create some distance, you might still be haunted by this fear of letting them down.
This feeling like you have to live your life according to their expectations.
Yeah, and it can be really paralyzing. You might be afraid to pursue your own dreams or to take risks or even just to do things that they wouldn't approve of.
And finally, the article talks about how enmeshment can make it difficult to form healthy, intimate relationships.
It might seem counterintuitive because you're so used to closeness, right?
But the thing is, healthy intimacy requires boundaries.
And people who grew up in enmeshed families, they often struggle with that.
So some people might be really afraid of getting too close to anyone, because they're scared of being engulfed.
And so they might keep people at arm's length or they might sabotage relationships before they get too serious.
But then other people might go the opposite way. They might become really clingy and dependent in relationships.
Because they're so terrified of being abandoned.
And so they might end up in these really unhealthy codependent relationships.
Where they're constantly seeking reassurance and validation from their partner.
So, it can really mess with your ability to trust and to be vulnerable.
And it can make it really hard to create a balanced, healthy relationship.
So for those of you who are listening and, maybe starting to realize, okay, this is me, I'm dealing with some of this stuff. What does the article suggest? What are some steps you can take to start redefining those relationships?
It often starts with, with having honest and respectful conversations with your family. And that can be really challenging, right?
Especially if you're not used to, to asserting yourself.
Yeah, and if you're worried about their reaction. But the article recommends, starting by talking about how certain dynamics have affected you.
But it's important to do it in a way that's not accusatory,
Right. Because the goal is not to like shame them or to make them feel bad. It's to communicate your own needs and to set boundaries.
And the article gives some really helpful examples of things you can say, like,
Really.
I love you, but I need to make my own decisions now.
Or I appreciate your concern, but I'm capable of handling this on my own.
And it's important to remember that, you don't have to have all the answers right away. This is a process, and it takes time.
And sometimes actions speak louder than words. So you might need to start by just making small changes in your behavior.
Like maybe you start calling your parents a little less often, or you stop sharing every detail of your life with them.
And they might not like it at first.
They might push back.
But if you're consistent, they might eventually start to respect your boundaries.
And some parents, they might even, like, be relieved.
Yeah, because they might realize that they've been putting too much pressure on you.
But it's important to be prepared for the possibility that, that some parents just won't change.
Yeah. And in those cases, you might need to distance yourself a bit to protect your own emotional well-being.
But even if you can't completely change the dynamic, you can still make choices that are healthier for you.
Like you can choose to limit your contact with them, or you can choose to not engage in certain conversations.
You have the power to create the kind of relationship that you want.
And the article provides some really great resources for people who want to learn more about enmeshment and how to deal with it.
Yeah, there's a whole list of books that they recommend.
One that I really like is Boundaries: Where You End and I Begin by Anne Catherine.
That's a classic.
Yeah, it's a great starting point for understanding what healthy boundaries are and how to set them.
And there's also Silently Seduced: When Parents Make Their Children Partners by Kenneth Adams.
That one goes into more detail about emotional incest.
And The Emotional Incest Syndrome by Patricia Love.
Which is another good one, specifically about enmeshment.
And then for a broader look at dysfunctional families, there's Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents by Lindsay Gibson.
And Facing Codependence by Pia Melody.
And the article also mentions some really helpful support groups.
Yeah, like Codependence Anonymous, CODA, and Adult Children of Alcoholics and Dysfunctional Families, ACA.
And those groups are not just for people with, substance abuse issues in their families. They're for anyone who's experienced any kind of dysfunctional family dynamics.
Including enmeshment.
And they can be a really great place to connect with other people who understand what you're going through.
And to get support and advice.
So, the main takeaway here is that enmeshment, it's a real thing.
And it can have a lasting impact on your life.
But the good news is that, you're not alone.
And there are things you can do to heal and to create healthier relationships.
So we encourage you to, to take some time to reflect on what we've talked about today.
And to think about how it might apply to your own life.
And if you're struggling, don't be afraid to reach out for help.
There are people who care and who want to support you.
And we'll leave you with this final thought to ponder. What's the difference between a healthy, loving connection with your family and a connection that's actually holding you back?
It's an important question to ask yourself.
And answering it can be the first step towards creating a happier, healthier life.
Thanks for listening.
We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.
See ya.